This is 99 Novels, a podcast by the International Anthony Burgess Foundation. In 1984, the writer Anthony Burgess selected his 99 favourite novels in English since the outbreak of the Second World War. Never short of an opinion about books, Burgess's list is typically idiosyncratic and invites closer attention, so we've invited some of the leading scholars, critics and writers to tell us more about each of the 99 novels. So read along with us as we explore a reading list created by one of the most original literary voices of the 20th century. In this episode, we're joined by novelist Adam Roberts, who introduces us to Life in the West by Brian Aldiss. Life in the West tells the story of Thomas Squire, a filmmaker who's attending an academic conference to introduce his new documentary, Frankenstein in the Arts. At the conference, he engages in conversations with the other attendees while dealing with the dissolution of his marriage, the trauma of his childhood, and the violent years he spent in Yugoslavia as a member of British intelligence. Burgess calls the novel a rich book, not afraid of thought. Brian Aldiss was born in 1925. After serving in Burma during World War II, he worked as a bookseller in Oxford, which was the inspiration for his first novel, The Bright Fount Diaries, published in 1955. He went on to become one of the most respected British authors of science fiction, writing 41 novels, 26 collections of short stories, 8 volumes of poetry, 5 volumes of autobiography, and many more works of literary criticism, drama, and edited anthologies. He died in 2017 at the age of 92. Adam Roberts is a writer and academic at Royal Holloway, University of London. His most recent novel, Lake of Darkness, is available now. A History of Fantasy is forthcoming from Bloomsbury in 2025. He blogs at medium.com/adams-notebook. For all the relevant links and a list of all the books mentioned, check out the description of this episode. I'm Graham Foster, and I spoke to Adam Roberts about Life in the West by Brian Aldiss in September 2024. Adam, welcome to the 99 Novels podcast. Today we're talking about Life in the West by Brian Aldiss. Thanks for joining us here to talk about this book. It's not a book that's particularly well known in Brian Aldiss's back catalogue, but I'm excited to talk about it with you.
Thank you for the invite. This is really interesting. I'm interested to discuss what we're going to make of this book, because as you say, it's not very well known, and it's not entirely kind of typical of what Aldiss generally does as a novelist. But a really interesting book.
Maybe we can start by describing the book to people who haven't read it. It's a strange book. It's not a book that is particularly plot heavy, but how would you describe it?
It's a novel of ideas, I suppose we would say. It's a contemporary set novel set in a version of 1980. It wouldn't be right to call it a realist novel exactly. But I say that because Aldiss is most famous for his science fiction. That's how he built his reputation, and his classic novels of the 60s and 70s are almost all of them science fiction. And he was a scholar of science fiction and an anthologist. And there is some stuff in this book about science fiction, but it's not a science fiction novel. It's a kind of regular novel about a character called Thomas Squire, who's a sort of academic, sort of television journalist who's become famous for a TV series he has just made. What's it called? Frankenstein in the Arts. Frankenstein in the Arts, yeah. Which is a sort of like Kenneth Clarke's Civilization, which was a big deal in the 1970s. It's a kind of contemporary version, a modern version of that. And that's made him famous. And so there's an academic conference in Sicily where he attends, and various characters who all have various different kind of perspectives and worldviews talk about their ideas, sometimes in the sense of giving papers at this conference. And we get monologues from the Frankenstein in the Arts series as part of the novel as well, sometimes just over They meet for drinks, or they have dinner, or they're walking by the beach, and they're talking all the time about the state of the world and the nature of philosophy and what's going on and what contemporary culture is all about, and some of the arguments that the Squire's character makes in his TV series. There is a kind of plot. We get to know about Squire's backstory growing up and the traumas of that. We get to know about his married life. He has two daughters and he lives in a large Georgian house and he's unhappily married. He's having affairs left, right and centre. A kind of through line in the novel as a narrative strand is his attempt to get into bed with a woman he meets at the conference that he fancies the pants off, and that doesn't come to anything. But he has sex with lots of other women, reflecting back on his previous life and looking to the future. It's the first of 4 novels, which are sometimes called the Squire's Quartet. So Life in the West, 1980, and then Forgotten Life, 1988, and Remembrance Day, 1993, and then a 4th one, which actually is a bit more, that moves into the future, as it were. So it becomes kind of science fictional, which is called Somewhere East of Life, which came out in 1994. And Squires appears again in these later novels, although they're not centrally about him. So we find out something of the kind of afterlife of Squires. But this novel is almost entirely about him. So a couple of salients are, he was too young to fight in World War II, but he did do some work as a sort of spy in Yugoslavia in 1948 and had various spy adventures. And then he's worked as a writer and as a journalist. He travelled to Singapore to shoot some of the scenes in the Frankenstein in the Arts show. So there's some meditations on the Far East. This is all taking place during the Cold War. So there's a lot of talk about Marxism and the battle of West and East and Russia and China. There's a lot of kind of travelogue stuff about the places that he's been to, which are kind of nicely described often. There's a lot in the novel, and it's quite a long novel. It's a little, I suppose, I don't know how you found it. It can be a bit hard work at times, kind of putting all this stuff together. It doesn't make many allowances for the reader.
Yeah, I very much thought of it in the same way I think of something like a Don DeLillo novel, something like The Names, which is Don DeLillo's novel about language. And it's full of characters having conversations about the meaning of language, the philosophy of language, what ancient language it means, that sort of thing. And the conversations that the academics have at the conference just reminded me of a Don DeLillo novel.
Yeah.
There are quite major differences between Aldiss and Don DeLillo, but the idea that this is a novel of philosophy and thought, I think, is very similar to the way Don DeLillo approaches his novels.
Yes, I think there's something in that. Or maybe a Pynchon novel where he kind of throws lots of fascinating ideas at the page, some of which stick and some of which don't. I mean, it's an interesting exercise in the sense that if I put on my academic hat, which I do actually have an academic hat. I'm not on me, unfortunately. Otherwise, I should have worn it for this podcast. An academic gown. I've been to plenty of conferences. There's a David Lodge novel called Small World, which is about academics going to conferences, which comes after this novel by, I think that's 84, I think, the David Lodge novel. So in a sense, Aldiss is ahead of the game. This is maybe one of the first novels about what it's like to go to an academic conference. The Lodge novel is a comedy, and it catches something of, when academics go to conferences, they do sit in rooms and read out kind of abstruse academic papers and ask questions of one another. But then when they're hanging out, mostly they're not doing that anymore. Mostly we're just gossiping about the state of the universities and what's going on in this place and what so-and-so's been getting up to. And it is more banal, and I think generally funnier than Aldiss is giving the impression in Life in the West. But the ideas are often really interesting, and it's like, okay, science fiction is a passion of mine, and I read Brian Aldiss growing up. I have to say I didn't read this until quite recently, because mostly my interest in him is science fiction, and he's a major science fiction writer. And it's interesting to see him coming at some of the ideas that he puts into his science fiction novels from a different angle in a book like this.
With that in mind, how does this relate to his more obviously science fiction work. Do you think it has parallels? I mean, you mentioned the ideas of the book.
Some of the ideas are ideas about science fiction. So that's the reason why the TV series is called Frankenstein in the Arts, is because Squires argues that Mary Shelley's novel, which is 1818, and its famous story about the scientist who creates this monster, it relates to Aldiss's argument, which he makes he wrote a history of science fiction called Billion Year Spree, which was 1973. And he later updated it, although after this novel, he updated it to Trillion Year Spree in the late 80s. One of the arguments he makes there is that Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is the first science fiction novel. And it's not that there were no fantasias before then. It's not that there are no stories that we could call kind of science fiction in a broad sense, people flying to the moon on the back of a giant goose or something. He says, no, the difference here is that this is a novel about a scientist, and it's about the consequences of a scientist, making something new, this new thing, which is what science fiction is about. And that Frankenstein's monster is kind of a technology. So the argument is, in the Life in the West, is that we're living in the aftermath of that science and technology have produced this enormous kind of profusion of new things, and that we ought to be happier than we are because we're surrounded by all these marvelous inventions, and the world has been changed so radically by science and by technology. And this is Frankenstein is the kind of founding myth of that state of affairs. He also points out that Frankenstein is a Gothic novel. It comes out of that Gothic tradition. You can read it as a sort of Gothic horror. It's full of spine-chilling moments. And Aldiss, as a writer, is quite fond of that. And he doesn't spare us in this novel either. So there are kind of strange Gothic moments that come through. So, for instance, that Squires' father is killed by his own dogs. He was a bit of a drinker, and he stumbled over his two mastiffs late one night and fell to the ground, and they ripped his throat out. And then the young child Squires discovers the father's body in the morning and thinks, what a horrible thing to discover, what a thing to kind of scar him as he goes through and grows up. Or, the scenes in Yugoslavia where, I don't know if you thought that section worked particularly well. It's like he feels, I have to put a spy story in here. In the 99 novels, Burgess praises Ian Fleming, and Bond was big, and John le Carré was making a big splash. And I wonder if Aldiss thought, well, I've got to put a spy section in. I'm not sure I found it very convincing.
You've raised a lot of points just in that one thing, but going straight on to the spy element of the novel, I didn't know what to make of it at first. And then there's a scene which I think is key, maybe it's about halfway through the novel, of him going to the British embassy in Sicily and reporting on all the attendance at the conference, which has some Russian people and has some Eastern European people. And he sort of grasses them up to the British embassy. And that scene made me think, hang on a minute, is he still a spy? He describes himself as an ex-spy, but suddenly the novel is his entire identity in the novel that is being talked about as a sort of pseudo-academic person. Is this all a cover for something else? So when I got to the actual spy section, the flashback, I was looking at it through that lens and not as a sort of adventure story.
What does he do? He goes to Yugoslavia in 1948, and then he has sex with a double agent. Is she? I'm not sure who she is exactly. And he travels around Yugoslavia, wins the trust of some Yugoslavs, and then it suddenly turns into there's hand grenades and guns and a big shootout. And he comes back having killed people. And that's one of the things that comes through the novel at several points. People say, "Oh yes, of course you've killed people, haven't you?" Which is something that most career academics have not done, I'd like to think. And I just wonder about that because, so this is another way of coming at the novel is to say, I know we talked about this before actually. You pointed out that Christopher Priest, who knew Aldiss really well, says, well, this isn't really a novel about an academic going to a conference. This is really a novel about Brian Aldiss. This is a kind of auto-fiction. He's fictionalized his own life. And in doing that, he's kind of translated aspects of his life into the fictional realm. So instead of it being a novel about a science fiction writer, it's a novel about a TV presenter and a different kind of writer. And instead of, as Aldiss did through the 1970s and 80s, going to lots of science fiction conventions and conferences of that kind and being a guest of honor, it's about an academic going to an academic conference. And then different elements from Aldiss's life find their way into the novel. So the one difference between Squires and Aldiss is that Aldiss was old enough to join the army in World War II, and he served in the Far East, in Malaya, and killed people. And he's written about that in his own autobiographical writings, and he's fictionalized that in a number of different novels that he's written. And this seems to be him kind of cathecting that into this particular story, because it's all about what it means to kill someone and how he feels about that afterwards, which is, I'm not sure it fitted the kind of spy framework particularly well. But I hear what you're saying. That's an interesting thing. You mentioned Le Carre. Le Carre said this more than once, that being a spy is about kind of betrayal, but it's also about kind of observation. It's also a kind of writerly thing, actually, that you observe people and you write them down, and then you're sort of exposing them to the world. And I could sort of see that here. So you think he's a spy all the way through, actually? You think that's a...
Well, I was questioning it.
Yeah.
It just seemed he found himself in certain locations throughout the novel that would have been useful for the British intelligence services. And of course, he's meant to be filming this television show, but, is that a front? Is he doing some other work on the side? And I think that tension is deliberate in the novel. There's another scene towards the end where he takes one of his Russian counterparts at the academic conference on a walk, and they end up on a cliff. And there's a very tense scene where Squire doesn't know if the Russian ex-KGB man is going to push him over the cliff, or he should push the Russian over the cliff, or if nothing's going to happen at all. So there is that tension all the way through the novel. And he's never at home either, to the point where he's renting flats a few miles away. And it seems very odd. The behaviour does not seem normal, really.
I take your point there. It's just, I think this is the sort of thing that Aldiss himself did. And I don't think Aldiss himself was actually a spy. Something happened kind of in the 1980s with him. And he starts writing, his first novel is 1958. And all through the 1960s, he publishes a lot of short stories and a lot of science fiction novels. And he has notable success and some great, great novels. He writes his History of Science Fiction in 1973. This in 1980, or he was writing it at the end of the 70s, is a kind of new departure because it's a quote-unquote realist novel. And I think it is a kind of auto-fiction. I think it's him putting his life into fiction. And his first kind of go of doing it, he estranges the character from himself in all sorts of ways that are kind of tells, almost, to use a poker idiom. He then goes on to write 3 more in the Squire Quartet, and then he writes a series of actual autobiographies. And the first of those is 1990, which is Bury My Heart at W.H. Smith, which is a really entertaining book about being just what it means to be a professional writer and the ups and downs of that as a career. And it's very witty, it's very funny, full of interesting observation. But it's his kind of public life. And he followed it with a book called Twinkling of an Eye, which was his memoir of his psychological state, in which he talks about how he felt his parents never loved him, his mother never loved him particularly, his mother rejected him, that she had a miscarriage before he was born and developed a kind of fantasy life for this unborn child who was a sort of angel. And when Brian Aldiss was born, she was disappointed that he was a boy. This is all Aldiss's version of it, and we don't have the mother's perspective. And she made him pray that the next child would be a girl. And then she gave birth to Aldiss's sister. And then the mother sent him away because she was worried that he would pass diseases onto the baby and give her whooping cough. So he had to go and stay with relatives, and then he had to go to boarding school, which he hated. And he felt this is a really profound rejection by his mother. And then in his adult life, and he talks about this in Twinkling of an Eye, I mean, he's quite open about it. He was repeatedly unfaithful to he was married several times. When his wife gave birth to a daughter, he then left the family home and rented a flat somewhere, kind of replicating this kind of initial trauma. And then he's constantly searching for some female affection and love and connection. And he's not finding that in any one particular individual. And that, I think, is the situation in Squire. And what's interesting in the novel is it doesn't tag that to the mother figure in the novel, who doesn't really figure. Although the second book in the Squire Quartet, Forgotten Life, is all about that. Is all about a character who everything I've just said about Aldiss and his troubled relationship with his own mother and his feelings of rejection. That's the whole theme of Forgotten Life, the next book in the quartet. And it ends with an extraordinary, prolonged moment when the adult character realizes that his mother did love him after all. And he feels this enormous lightning. It's a kind of transcendent moment. And it goes on and on and on. There's no such release in Life in the West, which sort of kind of fizzles out at the end. It doesn't really come to a big denouement. But there is, I think, a lot of that. One of the reasons I mention that is because one of the most famous things that Aldiss produced was the Heliconia trilogy, which is set as 3 fat science fiction novels: Heliconia Spring, Heliconia Summer, Heliconia Winter, which is set on a distant world with full of strange alien life forms and some humanoid life forms. And it's all being carefully monitored from Earth. Everyone's watching the life that's going on in Heliconia and the enormous elongated seasons that the strange orbit of the planet around its various stars results. And you see a whole civilization grow up on Heliconia. And it seems as far removed from a book like Life in the West as possible to imagine. But it's clear if you read in the interviews with Aldiss that he considers that also as a kind of autobiographical process. He was metaphorizing his own feelings into science fiction in the Heliconia books. So writing maybe in a less considered, a kind of more intuitive way, he now is starting to think, well, how does this all relate to my life and to the traumas of my life? And can I solve this? And it comes off the back of a kind of nervous breakdown that he describes in great detail and very kind of movingly, actually, in Twinkling of an Eye. And he went to therapy and he says he worked through it and that his later life he was much happier and more stable, and that's, or would like to think that's true. That's not what really happens in Life in the West, though. There's no breakthrough. There's no kind of working through all the things that have made Squire he's handsome and he's brilliant, but he's also clearly, not a nice person, and he's flawed in lots of ways.
I think it heavily hints that he's a psychopath, right?
Yeah.
You used the word trauma there, and I think that's a really good word to use when describing this book, because it is about Squire's trauma, really. The instigating incident that leads him to be a spy and kill people is, you mentioned before that his father got savaged by his own dogs. And Squire, as a 10-year-old boy, his instant reaction to that was to take his father's shotgun and shoot both the dogs. And that scene is described as a cold piece of action. There was no consideration in what Squire was going to do. He just did it. And when you compare that with the spy scene where he kills a man, there's a similar way he does it.
Yeah, and he does talk, doesn't he, about how he might have expected to be more upset at having killed people, but he says he wasn't. You come back to civilian life and you just get on with things. And again, I'm sure that speaks to the particularities. Psychopath is quite a loaded term, isn't it?
It is.
I suppose so we're talking about this as a novel of ideas, and one of the ideas is Squire has this kind of theory that we don't relate to people as people, really, that we relate to them as symbols. And there's a particular emphasis in the novel on the idea of the sex symbol, that lots of attractive women, most of whom Squire has sex with, he's saying in a way, sexual desire means you're not connecting with a person here. You're just seeing, all the kind of sexual trappings, everything that their allure, their attractiveness signifies to you, and that's as far as we can get connecting with people, which is a slightly sociopathic way of thinking about other human beings.
He gets called out for that, doesn't he? because the actress, the very young actress in his television show, he has an affair with.
And she says, yes, I'm not having that. I'm not a symbol, I'm a person.
Yeah, so he does get called out for that, which is interesting, I think.
It's interesting to me that this is, of the 99 novels, this is the one Burgess thinks, oh yes, this is the oldest novel, because it wouldn't be my choice, I have to say. And it's not that Burgess is hostile to the idea of science fiction. He's perfectly open. He's written science fiction himself many times. Something like, I don't know, Hot House 1962 or Greybeard 1964, brilliant novel, Greybeard, it's been copied many times, actually, about a world in which people stop giving birth and everyone just gets older and older, and we're all heading for a brilliantly written piece of fiction. And it's curious to me that Burgess chooses this novel. He praises it for its kind of thought and for its characterization, which the latter does seem a slightly, like you were saying, I think. It's not one of the great strengths of this book. As a novel of ideas, I think that's fine as a textual strategy, as a novelist's approach, is to give a series of characters who are differentiated by their ideas. And the only reason they're in the novel is to kind of expatiate upon what it is they believe about literature, about Marxism, about contemporary culture, whatever it might be. They're not characterized in the fullest sense. But that idea of, well, no, this is a book about thought, but it's also a book about the kind of messiness of life. And there is quite a lot of sex and violence in it. And that something about that appealed to Burgess as a writer.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about. When he says he admires the characterization in it, he must be talking about the characterization of Squire.
Yeah, I suppose you're right.
Who is the only character who's fully developed in the novel. Fully developed to the point where we know him inside and out by the end of the novel, I think. We find out a lot about him and a lot about his motivations. So perhaps that's what Burgess means when he praises the characterization of the novel. It is a novel that revolves around a charismatic character. And Burgess wrote novels like that, if you look at Earthly Powers.
I mean, in the preface to the 99 novels book, in the introduction that Burgess writes, he says, oh, what is a novel? And he defines a novel. And then he says, what's a good novel? And a good novel has to have good characters and a good story, and the dialogue has to be well done. But then he says, and it should leave a philosophical residue in the mind after you finish reading it. And that seems like a slightly odd thing to say, because obviously there are Burgess novels, I suppose. But does Earthly Powers leave a philosophical residue in the mind? It's a series of brilliant set pieces, and it's a marvelous novel. But
I suppose the biggest philosophical point in Earthly Powers is sin versus religion, and Toomey's identity as a gay man conflicting with his Catholic identity, and that conflict presents itself in all sorts of different ways throughout the novel, where you see sin and religion going hand in hand, particularly in the character of Carlo, who is the Pope but could also be Satan himself.
There are a couple of ideas that Burgess returns to in his fiction over and over again, and I think both are in Earthly Powers. And one is this idea of the importance of free will, which is a kind of theological idea rather than a kind of philosophical one, really. But that's the whole point of Clockwork Orange, that to take away a man's free will, even though it makes him into a docile, good citizen, that's a much worse thing than leaving him with his free will, even if he's going to use that free will to do terrible things. And that's something that Burgess believed quite deeply. And the questions of how much freedom we have and how we choose and on what basis we choose crops up repeatedly in his writing. But there's another idea which I reread the whole of Burgess not long ago, and it kind of came out, which is he's fascinated by innocence, which he sees as something kind of terrifying, actually, because it removes you from the kind of messy reality of living and interacting with other human beings. That people who are innocent are capable of extraordinary horror and crime, actually. And I think Carlo Campetti, the character who becomes the Pope in Earthly Powers, is kind of like that. He might be the devil, you're right, but he's a good priest in a sense, He's thoroughly devoted to his mission, but he's also a bit psychopathic. There's a scene in Earthly Powers where instead of telling the Germans who've invaded what they need to know, he allows people to be kind of tortured, and it's quite blithe about it. He says, well, no, this is a One Hand Clapping, which I think is an underrated Burgess novel about a young woman who's kind of an innocent, but is also perfectly capable of murder and all sorts of horrifying things. What I'm trying to get at is what was it that Burgess saw in this novel that made him go, well, this is the one Brian Aldiss novel that we must have on my list?
I think he liked the philosophical novels. He liked novels that led him to think about not only life in general, but also the power of fiction. I think he was very interested in the mechanics of novel writing and that sort of thing. So
you are right. I mean, there's I think 3 Aldous Huxley novels.
Yes, that's right.
99,
yeah.
And he starts by saying, well, he's published in 1984, so he starts by saying, look at the hold that the novel 1984, George Orwell's novel, has had on the popular imagination. That's what a novel can do when it's really, really good. It can kind of shape the way you see the world. And 1984 is a very talky novel. Half of it is just O'Brien lecturing Winston Smith about the nature of power and politics. And I can sort of see that, yeah. When a part of the issue, I think, with Life in the West is that it is a bit scattershot. It's kind of all over the place. It doesn't have a kind of a single philosophical thesis that it is developing. There's all sorts of stuff. Whatever crops up, they'll talk about it and they'll say, oh, yes, a pinball machine. And what does that signify? And what's the situation with Russia and China? What's going on there? What about global warming? What about the oil crisis? Some of these things that seemed really loomed large in the 1970s.
Well, I think the conference itself, I couldn't decide whether it was a parody of an academic conference or a way for Aldiss to get his ideas into the novel. But the conference, I can't remember the exact title, but it's about aesthetics, which is one of the loosest conference subjects ever. So you have Squire talking about Frankenstein in the arts, and then you have a guy holding forth about pinball machines being the collapse of culture because people put money in but don't get anything out in return.
That's right. The title is it is kind of broadly about aesthetics, you're right. The title is the First International Congress of Intergraphic Criticism. Intergraphic criticism just means anything you like, anything that is about any kind of writing or signifying, or the written word, the visual arts, and the way they relate to one another. It is a very kind of catch-all. I mean, there's the Russian paper, which is badly translated, so that what we get is this kind of weird, garbled. But even that, I think, is trying to communicate some ideas to the reader, even though it's being played a bit for laughs about how funny it is if the translator isn't up to the job. No, it's a tricky one there. I mean, I took it too seriously. I thought, this is just... here's another long paper from the conference. We're going to have to read through this and discover what is being argued.
We should say the novel isn't just sequential conference papers.
Yeah.
The papers quite often, the pinball one, in fact, is a sort of informal thing that happens outside of the conference room. But the real action of the novel takes place between these outbursts of ideas, I think. And I don't know what he's trying to say about academic conferences in general, but it is a way to explore a breadth of ideas, I suppose.
It did feel, I mean, I've been to academic conferences and I've been to science fiction conventions and kind of fan events, and it felt more like the latter than the former in the way that it kind of happens. As you say, it's all in one big hotel and everyone's going to papers, but they're also in the bar all the time, chatting or eating or walking down by the beach or whatever it might be. If we distill the big idea here, this is the Frankenstein's inheritance idea, that we are living in this time of extraordinary continual change, and everything is changing and everything is moving very fast, and that there's this profusion of technological marvels and amazing things which no generation in human history has had before, and yet we're still very miserable and unhappy as to why that should be.
I took the the focus on Frankenstein as science that has created something dangerous. So they're in the middle of the Cold War, and the constant threat of nuclear weapons, I suppose, is hanging over the conference.
So Aldiss wrote a book called Frankenstein Unbound in the 70s. I think it was 1973. Don't quote me on that, which is a midrash on Frankenstein. It's not exactly a sequel to Frankenstein, but it's set in a 21st century, which was then futuristic world, where time slips mean that whole, not just individuals and not just time machines, but whole farms and cities kind of slip out of time and re-emerge in a different time. And an American ends up in Switzerland in the 18 teens and meets Byron and Shelley and Mary Shelley. It turns out the monster is kind of real in this reality. And so he works, it's quite a nicely written Frankenstein's monster in that novel. But then the story goes in various strange directions. And one of the future timelines into which they slip, the whole of Europe and Russia is just a plane of glass, which you assume is the aftermath of some kind of cataclysmic nuclear exchange, and everyone's dead. And I suppose that connects back in with the idea of the kind of glacial plains of ice at the end of Frankenstein, or the icebergs rolling down.
I think that's really interesting that Frankenstein is obviously a cornerstone of Aldiss's thought, certainly at this time, sort of in the 70s, leading up to the publication of Life in the West. He's obviously thought about what the television show that Squire makes would consist of. And you describing Frankenstein as the proto science fiction novel, I think fits with the way it's described in Life in the West as well.
It's not me that describes Frankenstein as the proto science fiction novel. It is Brian Aldiss. So Brian Aldiss is Billion in the Spring, which is his history of science fiction. That's his big argument. It's just what it all begins with. Mary Shelley is the mother of science fiction. I'm not sure that's right, actually, but I don't want to get into abstruse academic disagreements. And it is very interesting. And it's interesting partly because it is this. I think you can read Frankenstein the novel either as a kind of science fictional fable about science and technology, or you can read it as a kind of older horror story. It happens to be something that a scientist has created, but it's an ogre or a kind of golem or some monstrous figure from fairy tale that then haunts the world and starts killing people. And the interesting thing about it is that we get a central section in the novel, which is from the monster's point of view, where he turns out he was abandoned as soon as he was created because Frankenstein, the scientist, was too horrified by what he had done. So he has a completely tabula rasa mind. And it's written upon by experience, and his experience is people are scared of him and horrified by him because he's so ugly. And that then creates him as a monster, which is, it's a kind of interesting moral fable. So I wonder if that goes back to what you're saying about Squire as a sort of sociopath, as someone who seems to lack degrees of human empathy in the novel. And what it says about Aldiss, I don't know.
So Squire's a sort of Frankenstein's monster himself.
Yeah. So the tabula rasa idea is John Locke, the 18th century English philosopher. And it was very current in the Enlightenment and in the early kind of Romantic period, that Mary Shelley had read Locke. So in part what she's doing by writing Frankenstein is she's saying, well, what would that actually be like if you really were born with a blank slate for a mind? I mean, I think in that, again, I want to get outside my area of expertise, but my understanding is no one really believes that anymore. No one thinks we're born with a perfectly blank slate on which experience writes. Obviously, in some regards, we have a genetic inheritance that gives us certain instinctual kind of attitudes and certain frames of thinking. And we have a gift for language, for instance, which is not true of other animals necessarily. By the same token, obviously, the experiences we have, which is one of the themes of this novel, do shape the kind of person that we grow into as adults. Obviously, that's also true. Shelley, I think, is doing a sort of thought experiment and saying, well, what if it were the case that we come in with a perfectly blank slate mind? How would that kind of work out? And he's clearly a monster of extraordinary capacity, intellectually speaking, because he learns not only to speak, but to read and write by hiding in a shed and peeping through a little hole in a wall into a cottage where a family is living and eavesdropping on them. And you're thinking, that's quite clever. Not just picking up their speech, but learning how to read and write as well. And he's a very eloquent monster in Shelley's novel. But I think that's also partly a self-reflexive thing, that this is a novel about being a writer, about writing experience, about that's the other meaning, I think, of the tabula rasa, the blank slate. Life is written. And this is true in this novel. This man's life is written on the pages in front of us. Brian Aldiss is a writer, and that's how he conceives things. There's a quotation from the first part of the novel is a kind of prelude, in which you get the thesis, I think, as it were. So this is from the Frankenstein in the Arts TV spiel that Squire does to camera. In 1818, Mary Shelley published her novel Frankenstein. It was something more than the Gothic novel it superficially resembled. It portrayed the scientist in a role we recognize today, or at least we did yesterday, as a man who strikes out for himself, discarding old authorities, caring little for the social consequences of his inventions. The result is a reign of confusion by the creature that Frankenstein the scientist has created. The welter of mass-produced goods which surrounds us today can be described as Frankenstein's legacy. And then we cut to Singapore. Singapore, this marvelous city, is also part of the legacy. There's as much a technological product as the digital quartz watch. But I wonder if that then speaks to the form of this novel, which is, it would be disparaging to call it a ragbag, but it's a book in which lots of different things are kind of crammed in, because it's a book about technological profusion, about the sheer crazy, chaotic variety of this Frankenstein's legacy about which he's talking.
Sure. But I think there's still an organisation to it.
It needs to be mediated, doesn't it? And it goes back to something you said right at the beginning of our chat, which is that this is not, it would misrepresent Life in the West to suggest that it's just a series of academics talking at one another. We get, we'll get a conversation between academics or a paper that's delivered at the conference, or we'll get a bit of a monologue from the Frankenstein TV series. But then there'll be, some other business. There'll be the chapters tend to hop between the present of the novel, which is, I think, 1979, and the past, particularly Squire's past and his childhood and his time in Yugoslavia and travelling around and so on. And it's layered in that streaky Bacon way, so that it's not as kind of unremitting as perhaps I've been suggesting. And you're right, you do get a sense of this character. He does sort of come together, and he's lived quite an interesting life. He's not a very likeable character, somewhere on the spectrum between not likeable and psychopathic.
Although there is a certain charm to him. It's not a likeable charm, but spending time with him is not particularly a chore, I don't think, for the reader. He has some interesting thoughts.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. And there's a kind of, it's a spoiler really to say, although it's not really the kind of novel that can be spoiled because it doesn't rely on narrative suspense or surprise. But for most of the novel, in the novel's present, he's separated from his wife, who's not happy that he's having affairs and fighting all the time. But at the very end, it looks like he's going to get back together with his wife and with his family. And there's a sort of, almost a hint of a kind of redemption arc going on there. He's tried his best to get into bed with a Signora Aggiani, I think she's called. And he sort of gets into bed with her at the end, but nothing really comes of it. And she's not really in the mood. And she's suggested earlier on in the novel that she might be amenable, but maybe not. And it doesn't actually happen. And that's quite interesting as well, the kind of non-consummation of that, which makes it less of a novel about midlife crisis and less of an adultery novel, although there is quite a lot of adultery in it.
I think it's important that Squire's marriage breaks down not because of his infidelity. It's because he finds out his wife has been unfaithful to him once, despite the fact that he's been all over the place. So there's that tension in the novel. I'm not entirely sure what to make of it. I would like to believe that Aldiss is criticising male characters for their sort of possessive attitudes to women. But I don't know enough about Aldiss to be certain in that, really.
I don't know. I mean, I didn't know Aldiss. I met him once. I interviewed him at the Cheltenham Literary Festival back in the early noughties. And he was immensely charming. He was a great guy to interview in a kind of public setting because he was an absolute pro, and he had a whole series of fascinating stories about, working with Stanley Kubrick and about meeting famous people and being a writer. And he was really good value for the people who bought tickets to hear me ask him questions on a stage. But then having a drink with him afterwards, and he's just really, really kind of charming and warm and interested in. I was much younger, and my writing career had just started. He was really interested in that, and very far from being psychopathic. I think this is quite a bitter self-portrait if we take it as a self-portrait. And I think as the Squire quartet goes on, he leaves some of that sort of self-loathing behind. And as he works through his own autobiography and fictionalizes it in the various ways that he does through the 80s and into the 90s, you get a more kind of measured and more balanced element to that, which I think is partly I'm guessing here, but I'm assuming the kind of therapeutic value of doing it in the first place, of revisiting your life and reconsidering all the things that have made you who you are and the traumas and so on. And as I've mentioned, the second book, Forgotten Life, it ends with this almost transcendent hymn to, my mother loved me all along. I just hadn't realized it. And now I feel completely at one with the universe, and I'm very happy, and all my miseries have gone away, and all my bad behaviors have stopped. Which I think is, in the novel, it's a slightly under-motivated climax. But I take it that it comes from Aldiss being in therapy after his breakdown and working through some of these things, in a way that was psychologically healthy for him, and arriving in a place where he was happier with himself.
You've sort of hinted at it through our conversation, but what do you think Aldiss's legacy is today? And are there any writers that are influenced by his work or working in the same tradition that he pioneered?
Well, I think so, yes, definitely. And he was one of the most important British science fiction writers. The influence it's compromised in one sense by the kind of the periodicity that he's writing in the 60s, which is a time in science fiction we talk about the new wave, and into the 70s. And in many ways, he was a sort of new wave writer, but he never quite tuned into what the new wave was doing. The new wave proved very influential. I mean, one of the interesting things about science fiction is the impact of Star Wars, the movie, on science fiction, because it's been so colossal. It's been this kind of global phenomenon. It kickstarted this big boom in blockbuster science fiction cinema through the 80s and 90s, which is still kind of a global dominant. I think if the Marvel Comic Universe movies, for instance, are kind of science fiction. Science fiction is still, Avatar takes billions at the box office. And one of the things that has done is it has shifted science fiction away from the written form, which is what traditionally it was, short stories and novels. They're still being written, still being published, and people still read them. But now science fiction is predominantly, the center of gravity it's a visual form of art. So the visual spectacular, sometimes very kind of beautiful and exciting, but cinema's not a good medium for ideas. It's hard to communicate ideas in a visual form of art unless you have characters sit down and talk at one another. Aldiss's science fiction, as kind of written form, he's been very rarely adapted to the screen, which is kind of interesting to me because he's a very famous writer and his novels are really, really good, but I'm not sure they're kind of cinematic, really. But in terms of kind of the question, yes, his heritage is still alive. And we mentioned Christopher Priest, who knew him, was friends with him. So my science fiction that I write myself is heavily influenced by all the Aldiss and indeed Chris Priest that I read growing up. There are writers who are doing a kind of the Aldissian thing, and less so with his non-science fiction. I think his reputation does rest on the science fiction more than the other companies. He's a very varied writer. He wrote all sorts of different sorts of things and was interested in lots of different things, but not all of it hits home as well as I think the great science fiction that he wrote does.
We should say, of course, he's been adapted once, is it? And that's the Spielberg film AI, which is based on Super Toy's Last Awesome Along.
It's a slightly complicated story, but yes, basically, yes. And there was a film of Frankenstein Unbound, which is a low-budget Roger Corman movie, which is very bad, which I'm not sure went on general release. But yes, then he wrote a short story called Super Toy's Last Awesome Along about an artificial boy that was originally going to be Kubrick, And then Kubrick died and passed it over to Spielberg. By the time Spielberg worked on it, he was working, I'm not sure, it's a very different film to the novel. The story is really, really brief. It's only a few pages long.
I should ask you the final question, which is one we ask everybody that comes on the 99 Novels podcast. If you could add 100th book to Burgess's list, what would it be and why?
The big omission, it seems to me, is Lord of the Rings. Maybe other people say this. And that's one of those ones where, in the preface to the 99 Novels, Burgess says, well, I'm only interested in kind of proper novels, kind of novels as works of art. So although I'd read with great pleasure the writing of Frederick Forsyth and Len Deighton and thrillers, I have not included any. And in fact, he does include some popular fiction, if you like, some bestsellers. But I think he looked down his nose at Lord of the Rings. It does seem to me, and this is Tom Shippey's phrase, the novel of the century. Is, I think, an amazing novel that gets short shrift because it's fantasy. Its omission is a bit puzzling. But then the omissions in the list are quite strange anyway, that he puts in several quite short novellas, but he won't put in Animal Farm because he says it's not a proper novel. You're thinking, well, isn't it? I think it probably is. And some of the selections he makes are enormous sequences of long novels that go on for tens of thousands of pages. You're thinking, is that a novel? That's a whole series of novels. He's quite, it's great. It's a fascinating and entertaining book. And I don't think it's a flaw that he's flexible with what he wants to include. But I think the Lord of the Rings should be there.
I don't know if Burgess has ever written about Lord of the Rings. I would have to have a look and go into the archive. But it strikes me as a book that Burgess would find a lot of value in because it's got all the Anglo-Saxon stuff and it's quite sort of literary.
It's more than that. It's centrally a book about language. And it was written because Tolkien invented a bunch of language because he was fascinated by language and the evolution of language and etymology. And he invented these languages, these Elvish and Dwarfish languages and so on. And then he wrote the story to create a world in which these languages could come to life. And that's exactly Burgess's jam, you would think. He was absolutely in love with language, Burgess, and quite happy, as famously in Clockwork Orange, to invent a language and an idiom and to explore the possibilities of that. So it does. I'm not aware of anywhere where Burgess has written about Lord of the Rings. He was certainly quite down on popular culture in the 60s and 70s, Burgess. He's famously hated the Beatles, let's say. And I suppose there's a sense in which the novel, it's a 1953 novel, Lord of the Rings, but it only becomes kind of well known in the 60s when it becomes a campus bestseller in the United States in paperback editions. And then suddenly it explodes. And then it's a bit associated with that kind of hippie, countercultural 1960s kind of vibe. And I'm sure that might be enough to put Burgess off enjoying it.
No, thank you for that choice. It is one that, believe it or not, hasn't been suggested up till now, and it seems so obvious now that you've said it.
Yeah.
But thank you, Adam, for joining us to talk about Brian Aldiss on the 99 Novels podcast. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks to you, Greg. No, it's been great.
You've been listening to 99 Novels, a podcast by the International Anthony Burgess Foundation. Lake of Darkness by Adam Roberts is out now from Gollancz. For more information about Anthony Burgess and the work of the Burgess Foundation, visit anthonyburgess.org. Sign up to the Anthony Burgess Foundation's free weekly newsletter at anthonyburgessfoundation.substack.com. The theme music for the 99 Novels podcast is Anthony Burgess's Concerto for Flute, Strings and Piano in D minor, performed by No Dice Collective. Find them online at nodicecollective.com.